She told me to forget what happened between us, but the way her eyes lingered said she hadn't forgotten either. It was one of those nights where the office felt more like a waiting room for ghosts than a place of work. Everyone else had gone home hours ago. The hum of the overhead lights, the faint rattle of the air conditioner, and the occasional whisper of papers shifting under the draft were the only sounds left. I was bent over a pile of reports at my desk, trying to ignore how the words blurred on the page. My shirt clung faintly to my back from the heat the building always seemed to trap at night. And then, without warning, I felt it, that subtle shift in the air when someone steps close. When I looked up, she was standing there. My boss. 42 years old, confident in every way that mattered, though in that dim glow she looked almost softer, less guarded. Her black hair had fallen from the neat bun she wore all day, a few strands brushing her cheek. She was still in her tailored blouse, but the top button was undone, her sleeves rolled carelessly to her elbows, not polished, not untouchable, just human. "You're still here?" she asked, her voice lower than usual, not the sharp, commanding tone she carried during the day. "Trying to finish these reports," I said, lifting the folder like proof. She gave a small smile, one that almost looked like an apology. "You're working too hard." There was nothing unusual about those words, but the way she lingered beside me was unusual. She leaned down, pointing at a mistake in my notes, her perfume surrounding me in a way I couldn't ignore. The distance between us shrank to something fragile, electric. I felt the warmth of her arm brushing mine as she steadied herself on the desk, her breath faint against my cheek as she explained something I couldn't even hear anymore. Because I wasn't listening to her words, I was listening to the silence between them. When she straightened up, I should have leaned back, given her the space she deserved. But I didn't. And when her hand reached across mine to take the pen, our skin met. Just a brush. Just a second. But her hand stayed there a beat longer than necessary. Our eyes met then. Hers were dark, sharp, usually filled with calculation. Tonight they softened, like she'd forgotten herself. My chest tightened, and the world outside that office ceased to exist. No deadlines, no fluorescent lights, just the two of us standing in a silence that wasn't professional anymore. It was her who moved first. She drew back quickly, almost too quickly, the chair scraping faintly against the floor as if to break the spell. Her lips parted, and her tone came back sharp, though her voice shook just slightly. "This never happened," she whispered. The words cut through the air, final, authoritative. But her eyes betrayed her. She couldn't quite look at me. Her fingers flexed against the folder in her hand as though she still felt the warmth of that accidental touch. I nodded because what else could I do? She was my boss. She had a career, a reputation, a carefully built world. And I was just me. But as she turned to leave, her steps echoing softly down the empty hallway, I knew the truth neither of us could name out loud. If it had truly meant nothing, she wouldn't have needed to say anything at all. She could have walked away and let silence bury it. Instead, she gave it words, fragile, desperate words. This never happened. And all I could think, sitting there in the dim glow of the office, was how wrong she was. Because it had happened. And it had already changed everything. The office always felt different in the mornings. Sunlight spilled in through the high windows, catching on glass walls and polished floors, turning everything too sharp, too clear. What had happened last night seemed impossible under this brightness, like it had been a dream born from exhaustion. Except it wasn't a dream. She walked in just after 9, heels clicking against the marble like a metronome. She was composed again, hair pinned neatly, blouse crisp, lipstick flawless. If anyone had looked at her, they'd never know what passed between us just hours ago. But I knew. And she knew too. For the first half of the day, we didn't speak more than necessary. She gave instructions in her usual calm, confident tone, but there was a hesitation to it, a pause just before her eyes flicked to mine. I caught her glances more than once, brief, stolen, quickly hidden behind the veil of professionalism. Every time her gaze brushed over me, I felt the memory of her hand on mine. That 1 second, still echoing in my skin like a phantom touch. I tried to bury myself in the work, but it was useless. My focus slipped, not because I couldn't do my job, but because every little detail reminded me of her. The way she leaned over my desk last night. The way her perfume clung to the air. The way her voice dropped when she said those words, "This never happened." At lunch, I almost escaped to the break room, thinking distance would help. But when I pushed the door open, she was already there, leaning against the counter, waiting for the coffee machine to finish dripping. For a moment I froze. She looked different without the armor of her desk or her staff around her. The sunlight through the blinds striked across her face, softening her sharp edges. She didn't look like my boss then, she looked like a woman, caught in the same confusion I was. Her eyes met mine, and there it was again, the pause, the hesitation, like she didn't know whether to speak or retreat. I stepped in, let the door close behind me. The quiet sealed us together. "You're avoiding me," I said, the words low, cautious. Her lips curved, but it wasn't a smile, more like an acknowledgement of something she couldn't control. "I'm your boss. I'm supposed to avoid this." I should have nodded, agreed, ended it there. But I couldn't. The memory of last night burned too hot. "Then why can't you forget it?" That question hung heavy in the air. She didn't answer, not right away. Instead, she busied herself with the coffee, pouring it into a paper cup as if the simple act could shield her from me. But her hand trembled, just faintly enough for me to see. Finally, she looked up, eyes steady, voice quiet but firm. "Because it can happen again. And because I don't trust myself if it does." It wasn't a confession, not really. But it was close enough. My chest tightened, because in those words was an admission she couldn't quite give. Last night meant something. It meant too much. The break room door opened then, and another coworker walked in, shattering the fragile thread between us. She straightened immediately, mask sliding back into place, and walked out without another word. But as she passed me, her shoulder brushed mine, deliberate, or maybe careless. Either way, it was enough to leave me standing there, pulse racing, coffee forgotten. The world outside that tiny room went on as normal. But inside me, nothing was normal anymore. And for the first time, I realized this wasn't just about temptation or curiosity. This was the start of something neither of us could control. The office emptied out slowly that evening. One by one, chairs rolled back, computers clicked off, and goodbyes echoed faintly down the hallways. By 7, the building was almost silent, the hum of the air conditioning filling the spaces people had left behind. I stayed, finishing a report she'd assigned me. At least, that was the excuse I gave myself. In truth, I knew she was still here. Her light was on. I'd seen it through the glass wall of her corner office. And a part of me didn't want to leave. When the clock hit 8, I stood and stretched, my body aching from hours at the desk. Curiosity pulled me toward her office door. I told myself I'd just hand in the report and go. Nothing more. Nothing less. I knocked lightly. "Come in," she called, her voice calm, professional. I pushed the door open, and there she was, sitting at her desk, blazer off, blouse sleeves rolled up, hair falling loose in a way I'd never seen during the day. Papers spread across her desk, pen in hand, but her shoulders were tense. "Tired. You're still here," I said softly. She looked up, offering a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "So are you." For a moment neither of us spoke. The weight of the quiet pressed down on us, thicker than the silence of the empty office outside. "I finished the report," I said, placing the folder on her desk. "Good," she murmured, flipping it open, scanning quickly. But I noticed the way her hand stilled halfway down the page, her focus slipping. She wasn't just reading, she was stalling. "You work too much," I said, leaning slightly against the doorframe, my tone gentler than it should have been. Her eyes flicked up, sharp, almost defensive. But then they softened. "I could say the same about you." The words should have ended there. They didn't. I stepped further in, until I stood across from her desk. The low light of the desk lamp cast shadows across her features, softening the lines I usually saw under harsh fluorescent bulbs. She looked different. Less untouchable. More human. She noticed me staring. I could tell by the faint flush at her neck, the way her hand fidgeted with the pen. "This is why it can't happen," she said suddenly, her voice firm, as if reading my thoughts. "We can't even be in the same room without what?" I asked quietly. Her lips parted, but no words came out. The silence between us grew thick, filled with everything we weren't saying. I moved closer slowly, giving her space to stop me if she wanted. My hand brushed lightly against the back of her chair, not touching her, but close enough that the air between us seemed to vibrate. She looked up at me, and for the first time since last night, there was no mask. Just raw honesty flickering in her dark eyes. "I told you," she whispered, almost broken. "This never happened." "Then why do you look at me like it did?" I whispered back. Her breath caught. I felt it more than I heard it. The moment stretched, fragile, dangerous. She could have ended it, pushed back, dismissed me, retreated into her role. Instead, she stood slowly, the chair sliding back, bringing her close enough that I could see the faint tremor in her hand as she set the pen down. We stood there, face to face, no desk, no rules, no pretense between us. And for a heartbeat, I thought she might close the distance. But she didn't. She stepped back, straightened her shoulders, her mask sliding back into place. "You should go," she said softly, though her voice wavered. I hesitated, searching her face. There it was again, that conflict, that one she wouldn't name. I turned, walking toward the door. But just before I stepped out, I glanced back. She was still watching me. And that look, unguarded, full of everything she wouldn't admit, followed me all the way home. By the time Friday arrived, the week felt heavier than most. I'd gone through the motions of meetings, reports, and daily tasks, but all of it blurred together. What stayed sharp in my mind were the moments when her eyes lingered, or when her voice faltered just slightly as she addressed me in front of others. The tension between us wasn't hidden anymore, at least, not to me. It pulsed beneath the surface, steady, undeniable. That evening, a storm rolled in. Thick clouds turned the sky an iron gray, and rain lashed against the tall glass windows of the office. Most of the staff had already left to escape the weather, but I stayed, finishing up loose ends. When I glanced at her office, her light was still on. I don't know what pushed me to knock again. Maybe it was the storm. Maybe it was the restless energy that had built up all week. Maybe it was just the need to see her without the audience of the entire office. "Come in," she called, her voice faint over the steady drumming of rain. When I stepped inside, she was standing near the window, arms folded across her chest. Her blazer hung over the back of her chair, leaving her in a pale blouse and dark skirt. She looked out at the storm as though it mirrored the chaos inside her. "You're still here," I said, my voice lower than I meant. She turned her head, meeting my eyes. "So are you." The words echoed from nights before, but this time, there was no smile behind them, just weariness. The storm outside cracked with lightning, throwing a flash of white light across the room. For a moment, I saw her expression clearly, guarded, conflicted, but soft in ways she wouldn't admit. "You work too hard," I said, stepping closer. "And you don't know when to leave," she replied, though there was no real bite in her tone. We stood there, the air thick with the weight of everything unsaid. My chest tightened, as though the storm outside had crept inside too. Finally, she broke the silence. "This can't keep happening." My throat felt dry. "You mean us pretending nothing's happening?" Her lips parted, but she didn't respond. Instead, she turned fully toward me, arms dropping to her sides. Her eyes searched mine, desperate and uncertain all at once. "I told you before, this never happened," she whispered, but the words trembled. "Then why do you sound like you're trying to convince yourself?" The question hung there, louder than the storm. Her breath caught, and I saw her shoulders rise and fall, saw the fight inside her. "Because if I don't, I'll..." She cut herself off, pressing her lips together, shaking her head. I closed the distance, just enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her. "You'll what?" I asked softly. Her hand lifted slightly, hovering in the air between us, trembling as though it wanted to reach for me but didn't dare. For a moment, her fingers brushed mine, the lightest touch, but it felt like fire. Lightning cracked again, and she pulled back, taking a sharp step away as though she'd burned herself. Her eyes squeezed shut, and when she opened them, there was pain in them. "You don't understand," she said, voice breaking. "If I let this happen, I don't know how to stop it. And I can't afford that. Not with you." The words sliced through me, because they weren't rejection, they were confession. I took a slow breath, forcing calm into my voice. "Then maybe the question isn't whether you can stop it, but whether you really want to." For the first time, she had no answer. We stood in silence, the storm raging outside, both of us caught in the eye of something even more dangerous. Something we'd both been denying for too long. And in that stillness, in that fragile moment, I realized we were already past the point of pretending. The storm hadn't passed. By the time the office emptied again the next evening, the clouds still hung heavy, rain streaking the glass walls like a curtain. The sound filled every silence, as if the weather itself refused to let go of yesterday's chaos. I stayed late, though my work had been done for an hour. I told myself I was tying up details, but deep down, I was waiting. For what, I didn't know, maybe for her to leave first, maybe for her not to. At some point, the lights flickered faintly, thunder shaking the building. I rose to stretch, only to notice her office door ajar, a warm glow spilling into the hallway. I hesitated before walking toward it, each step deliberate, steady, as though I was crossing into dangerous territory. She was there, sitting on the edge of her desk, head bowed, one hand pressing against her temple. She looked tired, not just from work, but from carrying too much weight for too long. "You okay?" I asked gently. Her eyes lifted to mine, and for a second, her guard slipped entirely. "Do I look okay?" she whispered, voice frayed at the edges. Something in me broke then. I closed the door softly behind me and crossed the room. She didn't move away this time. She didn't tell me to leave. I stood in front of her, close enough to feel her breath. "You don't always have to hold everything together," I said quietly. Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, her eyes shimmered, not tears exactly, but the kind of vulnerability she usually buried deep. Slowly, almost without thinking, I reached out, letting my fingers brush her hand where it rested on the desk. She didn't pull away. Instead, her hand turned, palm meeting mine, her fingers curling faintly against my skin. It was the smallest gesture, yet it felt monumental, as if the storm outside had finally broken through into the room. "I told you this can't happen," she murmured, though her grip didn't loosen. "Then why are you holding on?" I asked, my voice barely above the rain. Her breath caught, her chest rising sharply. For the first time, she didn't have an answer. She just looked at me, her gaze flickering over my face as though memorizing something she wasn't allowed to keep. I stepped closer, the space between us shrinking until I could feel the warmth of her legs against mine. The air was thick, every second stretched thin with tension. My free hand hovered near her arm, not daring to touch, not unless she allowed it. She let out a shaky breath, and then, slowly, tentatively, she leaned forward, resting her forehead against my chest. The contact was soft, fragile, but it unraveled me completely. My arms came up instinctively, one resting lightly around her back, the other brushing along her arm. She melted into the hold, her body trembling faintly as though she'd been holding this back for far too long. We stayed like that, suspended in the quiet stormlight, her heartbeat against mine. "This never happened," she whispered again, muffled against me. But this time, I could hear it for what it was, not denial, but fear. Not rejection, but surrender. I pressed my cheek against her hair, breathing her in, the warmth of her skin searing through the thin fabric of her blouse. "It happened," I said softly. "And you know it." She didn't answer, but her hands tightened faintly against me, a silent confession that words couldn't hold. Outside, the thunder rolled on. Inside, the storm finally touched us both. The morning after our embrace felt unreal, like I'd stepped into someone else's life. The office buzzed as usual, phones ringing, keyboards clattering, voices echoing in hallways, but none of it reached me the same way. Every sound seemed distant, muted, as if I'd been pulled into a different current. But every time I glanced toward her office, I was snapped back. She was different too. Not in her work, she carried herself with the same poise, the same authority, but in the flickers between. A pause in her voice. A glance that lingered one beat too long. A faint tension in her shoulders when she caught me watching. It should have been enough for us to retreat, to step back before anyone noticed. But instead, it felt like we were pulled closer by some invisible thread we couldn't cut. That afternoon, a meeting ran long. The conference room was full, papers rustling, voices rising and falling. She sat at the head of the table, confident as always, her gaze steady as she guided discussion. But when her eyes slid to mine across the table, just for a second, everything else faded. It was too quick for anyone else to notice, but I saw it, the unspoken acknowledgement of what we'd shared. My chest tightened. If anyone else saw even a fraction of what I saw, the secret would shatter. Afterward, when the others filed out, she stayed behind. I lingered too, shuffling papers as though I had a reason. When the door closed and silence settled, she let out a breath she'd been holding all along. "You can't look at me like that when they're around," she said softly, not accusation but plea. I swallowed. "And how do I look at you?" Her lips curved faintly, bitterly. "Like this is more than it should be." I stepped closer, the weight of her words pressing against me. "Maybe it is." Her eyes flickered, a storm of conflict beneath the surface. She didn't step back, but her arms folded tight, as if trying to hold herself together. "Do you understand what happens if anyone finds out? My career, your reputation, everything could come undone." Her fear wasn't unfounded. She wasn't just my boss, she was respected, admired, the kind of woman people looked up to. And me? I was younger, newer, easier to dismiss. If whispers started, they wouldn't blame her strength. They'd question her judgment. Still, I couldn't let her retreat into that wall of fear. "And what happens if we keep pretending?" I asked. For a moment, she had no answer. The silence stretched, filled only by the ticking of the wall clock. Then, quietly, she admitted, "I don't know which is worse." The vulnerability in her voice was something I'd never heard before, not from her, not from anyone. It pulled me closer, until I stood just a step away. My hand lifted, hesitated, then brushed against her arm, light as air. She closed her eyes at the contact, exhaling shakily. "We can't, not here," she whispered. "Then where?" I asked, my voice low, steady. Her eyes opened, meeting mine with a depth that rooted me in place. "Nowhere," she said, but the way her body leaned infinitesimally toward me betrayed her words. We didn't move closer, not this time. The risk was too real, the walls too thin. But the current between us was undeniable, heavy, suffocating. As I left the conference room, I caught her reflection in the glass door. She was still watching me, her mask back in place, but her hand rested against the table as if holding herself steady. The world outside believed nothing had changed. But we both knew it had. And now, it was only a matter of time before the truth broke through. The week ended quietly, though nothing about it felt calm. The office emptied on Friday evening, leaving behind the faint smell of paper and coffee, the low hum of electronics that never truly shut off. I lingered at my desk, my pen still in hand though I hadn't written anything in minutes. Her light was still on. I told myself to leave, to walk out the door and not look back. But my feet didn't listen. They carried me down the hallway, each step echoing like a drumbeat in the stillness. When I reached her office, the door stood half open, a golden slice of lamplight spilling into the hall. She was there, leaning against her desk, arms crossed, gaze fixed on the floor. When I pushed the door gently, she looked up. And in her eyes I saw everything she hadn't said all week: fear, longing, exhaustion, and something else too, surrender. You should go, she said softly. I've been trying to, I admitted, my voice low, raw. All week. But I can't. Her lips parted, as if to argue, but no words came. She pressed her hands against the desk behind her, steadying herself. You don't understand the risk, she murmured. I do, I said, stepping closer. But I also understand this. Whatever this is between us, it's real. And I'm done pretending it isn't. She let out a shaky laugh, though there was no humor in it. You're too young to understand what it costs to give in to something like this. Maybe, I admitted. But you're too smart not to know what it costs to keep running from it. The silence stretched. Only the hum of the desk lamp filled the room. She looked at me then, really looked, as if weighing every possibility in her mind. I could see the storm of it in her eyes. And then, slowly, she pushed herself away from the desk and crossed the small space between us. She stopped just a breath away. Her hand lifted, trembling slightly, before brushing against my jaw. The touch was tentative, almost reverent, as if she feared I might disappear if she pressed too hard. This shouldn't happen, she whispered. But it is, I whispered back. Her eyes searched mine one last time, and whatever resistance she had left faltered. She leaned in, her forehead resting against mine. The warmth of her skin, the tremor in her breath, it was everything I'd been aching for, everything she'd been fighting. For a moment, we stood like that, neither moving further nor pulling away. It was a fragile balance, the last edge before a decision. Then her hands slid down, resting against my chest, and I felt the quiet strength in them. She wasn't running anymore. This changes everything, she said softly, her voice steady now. I know, I answered. But maybe it's worth it. She closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, there was a calm acceptance in them, not the mask she wore at work, not the denial she clung to, but something real. Her lips brushed mine, soft and hesitant, but it was enough to break whatever wall still stood between us. The kiss was brief, tender, weighted with everything we hadn't said. When she pulled back, her hand lingered against my cheek. If we do this, she said quietly, we do it knowing there's no going back. I nodded. Then let's not look back. The storm that had followed us all week seemed to ease in that moment, replaced by something still fragile, but steady. For the first time, the words, "This never happened," didn't hang between us. Because we both knew it had, and it always would. 26L